There are moments in an interview when a man stops performing and simply tells the truth. And when David Phelps reached that moment, in a conversation that was never supposed to go this deep, what came out of him wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was something that had clearly been living inside him for a very long time. What David said about Bill Gaither in that moment, and what he admitted about his own years of silence on the subject, is the kind of thing that doesn't get shared lightly. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why it took him this long to say it out loud. Stay with us, because what unfolds around the 10-minute mark is something the gospel music world has danced around for years without ever saying directly, and David finally said it, with the weight of it showing plainly on his face. For anyone who spent time in the world of Gaither Homecoming music, David Phelps needs no lengthy introduction. But for those discovering this channel for the first time, perhaps through a recommendation that brought you here unexpectedly, it's worth taking a moment to understand who this man is and why so many people care so deeply about him. David joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 1997. And from almost the very first note he sang in that setting, it became clear that something singular had arrived. His voice, a lyric tenor with a range that crosses into countertenor territory and lands with a power that few singers in any genre can match, became one of the defining sounds of the late Homecoming era. Songs like End of the Beginning and his staggering live performances of the Hallelujah chorus built a following that was loyal in the way only gospel music fans can be loyal. Not casually, not the way you follow a pop act, but with the kind of devotion that comes from hearing something that sounds like it was built for a church rather than a stage. For millions of fans who grew up watching the Gaither Homecoming videos on VHS, playing those recordings in their living rooms and their cars and their quiet moments, David wasn't just a singer. He was part of the soundtrack of their faith, and the way his voice broke open on the high notes felt like permission to feel something, permission to believe something, permission to let the Spirit move in a moment of music. That kind of connection doesn't fade. It deepens with time. And so when David speaks, his audience listens, not just for the music, but for the man. Before arriving at what was said, and before reaching the moment that brought tears to his eyes, it helps to understand what the relationship between David Phelps and Bill Gaither actually looked like from the inside, because from the outside it looked like the dream. A young singer with an extraordinary gift being guided by one of the most legendary figures in the history of Christian music, a mentor and a protege, a producer and his most celebrated voice. That surface reading was accurate in many ways. Bill Gaither gave David a platform that very few singers in gospel music history have ever been handed, and the Homecoming videos, the tours, the recordings, all of it placed David in front of an audience of millions at a point when he might otherwise have spent years working his way up through smaller venues and regional recordings. Bill saw something in him and opened a door that David has never stopped being grateful for. But here's the thing. What the fans watching those videos didn't always see, what the stage didn't fully reveal, was the inner texture of that relationship. The bond between an artist and a patriarch, and that is genuinely the right word for what Bill Gaither has been to the gospel world, is never simple. Expectations live inside it. Pressures accumulate. Moments arise when the vision of the man who built the institution and the voice of the man who sings inside it pull in different directions, and for years David navigated all of that quietly, professionally, with the kind of grace that the gospel community tends to expect from its artists. What he kept to himself during those years, and what he has only recently begun to let out, is the part of the story that most coverage of his career passed over entirely. And it matters, because it tells you something true about what it costs to carry a gift like his, and something equally true about what it means to be shaped permanently by someone like Bill Gaither. We'll come back to exactly what David revealed in that interview in just a moment, but first the timeline matters, because the specific sequence of events here carries more weight than most people realize. David left the Gaither Vocal Band in 2005, and at the time many considered him to be at the peak of his powers with the group. The departure got handled with characteristic grace on both sides, publicly with kind words and warmth in the official statements, and David went on to build a successful solo career, recording, touring, raising his family alongside his wife Lori, continuing to sing in the circles that had loved him for years. But the timing always raised a quiet question among fans who were paying close attention. Why then, why at that particular moment, when his profile had never been higher? And what was the rest of the story? For years, answers came in vague generalities about pursuing solo work, about the natural evolution of a career, about family priorities, and all of those things were true, but none of them were the whole truth. And that's when the interview changed everything. The conversation wasn't a formal sit-down produced specifically for a major platform. It was the kind of exchange that happens when a man feels comfortable, when the cameras feel less like cameras and more like witnesses, when a question lands in a way that opens something up rather than inviting a rehearsed answer. And somewhere in the middle of it, the interviewer asked David about his relationship with Bill Gaither, not about the music, not about the catalog, not about the legacy, but about the relationship itself, the personal, human, complicated reality of it. David paused. Anyone who has watched enough interviews with gospel artists, and many of you have watched more than most, will recognize the particular quality of that kind of pause. It's not a man searching for a diplomatic answer. It's a man deciding how honest to be, and in that pause you could see something moving across David's face that 30-plus years of ministry and platform experience couldn't quite contain. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in his circle expected. What David said haltingly, with genuine emotion rising in his voice, was that Bill Gaither had shaped him more than he had ever fully acknowledged in public. And not just musically or professionally, but spiritually, personally, in the way a man can be shaped by someone who sees things in him that he doesn't yet see in himself. But then he said something else, and this is the part that landed differently. He said that for years he hadn't known how to hold both things at once, the gratitude and the grief, the love for a mentor and the real, genuine pain of certain moments in that relationship that had never been fully processed or spoken about. The gospel world, the world David had given his entire adult life to, doesn't always make room for that kind of complexity. Fans want the harmony. They want the image of these artists moving together in faith and purpose, and David understood that. So he honored it by staying quiet about the parts that were harder to sing about. And that was when his voice broke. Not a dramatic breakdown, not the kind of moment that gets clipped out of context to generate shock, but something quieter than that. A man whose eyes filled and whose voice lost its steadiness for a moment before he took a breath and continued. What he said after that breath is something the gospel community has rarely heard stated this plainly. He said he had spent years being afraid that his honest feelings about certain seasons of his career, including seasons within the Gaither organization, made him ungrateful, and that expressing any complexity or pain about a relationship that had given him so much felt, in his own internal world, like a kind of betrayal. What it took him a long time to understand, through personal work and spiritual work, was that gratitude and hurt are not opposites, that you can love someone deeply and genuinely and still carry wounds from the relationship that need to be acknowledged to be healed. The interviewer didn't push or probe for specifics, and David didn't offer a list of grievances or a detailed accounting of what had gone wrong when, because that wasn't what this moment was about. What he did say, and this is the part that several people who followed his ministry closely found most unexpected, was that he had recently reached out to Bill, that a conversation had happened which he described only as long overdue, that he had said things he needed to say, and that Bill had responded with a grace that David said he should have expected, but that moved him deeply nonetheless. His words were, "Bill Gaither is one of the reasons I am who I am," and I don't think I ever told him fully what that meant. Not the easy version, the real version. For those who have followed David's journey from those early homecoming tapings through his solo years, through his family's health challenges, through the seasons when he stepped back from the stage, and the seasons when he returned, that sentence carries a particular weight, because it tells you that the man behind the voice was doing something harder than singing. He was doing the quiet, unglamorous work of honesty with someone who mattered to him. There is something happening right now in the gospel community that this moment is a small but meaningful part of, and it connects to names and seasons that this audience knows well. A generation of artists who came of age in the homecoming world, who were shaped by it, elevated by it, and in some cases wounded by aspects of it, are reaching a point in their lives where enough distance exists from those years to allow honest reflection, not bitterness, not revisionism, but the kind of clear-eyed honesty that is only possible when enough time has passed and enough healing has occurred. David Phelps, by most accounts, is not a man who seeks controversy or courts attention through revelation. The way he carries himself in interviews, in concerts, in the occasional glimpses of his family life that his audience gets to see, reflects someone who has always valued integrity over spectacle, which is precisely what makes a moment like this one worth paying attention to. When a man like David gets emotional talking about something, it is not theater, it is evidence. And for those who have been fans since the early homecoming days, who remember the first time they heard him hold a note that seemed to go on past what any human throat should be able to sustain, you know exactly what we mean when we say that the real gift David Phelps carries has never been only about his voice. It's always been about his willingness to mean what he sings, to stand behind the words. What do you carry from your own years of following this ministry? And if you've been in these fans' shoes, watching those homecoming videos in a quiet living room, hearing David's voice in a moment of personal struggle or loss or joy, we'd love to hear what this story means to you in the comments. There's one more part of this story that most people haven't connected yet, and it reaches back through the history of the Gaither world in a way that reframes what David's moment in that interview actually represents. Bill Gaither has a long and documented history with artists who carry extraordinary gifts alongside complicated inner lives, and those who have studied the homecoming archives closely know this pattern runs deep. Russ Taff's story, now well documented and spoken about by Russ himself, with extraordinary courage and candor, involved a period of deep personal struggle that intersected in complicated ways with his professional life and his place in the gospel world, and what rarely got discussed was how Bill's response to Russ in those years became, for many in that circle, a kind of model for how to hold an artist in their brokenness without releasing them. Michael English's story followed a different arc, with its own particular pain and its own particular grace, and again what the public narrative often missed was the texture of what restoration actually looked like, not the announcement of it, but the slow, quiet work of it happening between real people. What David's moment in that interview reflects, placed alongside those stories, is something worth naming directly. The Gaither world at its best has always been a community that believes in restoration, that believes a man's story is not over at his lowest point, that believes the same grace sung about in those songs is supposed to operate in real relationships between real people. David reaching out to Bill, the conversation he described as long overdue, the tears in the interview, all of it points toward that belief being lived out rather than merely performed. And for an audience that has given decades of devotion to these artists and this music, that is not a small thing. Now, with all of that said, what happens next for David Phelps and for the conversation he has quietly opened deserves more than a brief closing thought, because the implications of this moment reach further than a single interview. David Phelps has been a fixture in gospel music since the late 1990s, and his influence on the genre's vocal tradition is the kind that gets discussed in music schools and worship ministries alike, not just among casual fans, but among trained musicians who study what he does with a lyric tenor voice and recognize how rare it is. The Gaither Vocal Band, across its many configurations and decades, produced some of the most beloved recordings in Southern gospel and inspirational music, and David's voice is woven through that catalog in a way that simply cannot be separated from it. When he sings, listeners are not just hearing a performance, they are hearing a theological statement delivered through music, and that carries weight in a tradition where the song and the singer are expected to be aligned. The decision to finally speak honestly about the more complicated dimensions of his relationship with Bill Gaither is, in that context, a kind of pastoral act as much as it is a personal one. David isn't just processing something privately, he is modeling something publicly, and the audience watching him do it is an audience that has been shaped by the same tradition he's speaking from. Many of the people who follow this channel, who have watched these artists across decades of homecoming recordings and concerts and television specials, carry their own complicated relationships with mentors, with institutions, with communities of faith that gave them everything and also cost them something. When David puts language to that experience, he gives those viewers permission to do the same in their own lives, and that is a ministry that extends well beyond the stage. There's also something worth sitting with regarding what this moment suggests about the future of David's public voice. Because artists who reach the point of this kind of honesty often enter a new creative season, one where the work carries a different weight than it did before, one where the songs mean something different because the singer has passed through something real and come out the other side of it. The gospel tradition has always made room for that kind of testimony, the song that comes out of the valley rather than the mountaintop, and David's willingness to publicly acknowledge that he has been in that valley, relationally and spiritually, positions him for exactly that kind of work. And then there is the legacy question, which the gospel community will be wrestling with for years to come, because Bill Gaither's contribution to Christian music is not only musical, it is institutional, it is generational, it is the infrastructure through which an entire tradition has been passed from one generation of artists to the next. David Phelps is one of the most prominent voices that infrastructure ever produced, and when he says publicly that his relationship with Bill shaped him in ways he had not previously named, he is adding a layer of complexity to a legacy that has mostly been told in celebratory terms. That doesn't diminish the legacy. If anything, it deepens it, because legacies that can only survive in their simple version are fragile in a way that legacies built on honest relationships are not. Whatever comes next for David and his family, and for the ongoing conversation between him and Bill Gaither that he described as long overdue, those who have followed this ministry for decades know one thing with certainty: David's story is nowhere near finished, and the chapter he appears to be entering may be the most honest one he has ever lived. If this story moved you, the next video in this series will as well, because we have been covering a chapter of Guy Penrod's life that very few fans are aware of, and what came out of that situation is just as unexpected and just as human as what you heard here today.